Zero tolerance. It's not so zero anymore. I'm Scott Ott, and this is Bill Whittle Now. And Bill, this story from the Los Angeles Times, by way of the Sacramento Bee, I believe, says that employers are continuing to run drug screening tests on potential hires, but they're not necessarily displaying a zero tolerance policy toward people who turn up with little THC in their blood or urine. Let me just get your initial response to this. And as you know, states across the country are increasingly legalizing various usages of marijuana, including for medical purposes, but also for recreational purposes. So why not have employers catch up to this trend and basically say, well, if it's legal, we hire people who drink, so why wouldn't we hire people who smoke dope?
There's a big billboard on Ventura Boulevard not far from where I live, which I get to pass occasionally. It's a big red billboard, and it says, "Click, click, puff. Medical marijuana delivered to your door, just that easy." And there you go. So, on one hand, I can hardly fault employers for no longer disqualifying people who are committing legal acts in California, right? I mean, if you're screening for marijuana and not for cocaine or amphetamines or heroin or any of the rest of this stuff, if you're screening for marijuana and if on the streets of LA anyway, the number of these tiny little doors in strip malls with a green cross over the top far outnumbers Starbucks, and I mean by a factor of 3, then it's hard to get up on your hind legs and talk about how terrible this is in terms of falling standards. But nevertheless, falling standards is exactly what it is. Look, I think the war on drugs is a mistake. I'm a firm believer in individual liberties and the right to swing your fist unless it hits my nose. And to be perfectly honest with you, people lighting up a joint in their living rooms has no effect on me whatsoever. You could maybe make a case that it had some effect on me in terms of being on the road, but let's just put that aside for a minute. So on one hand, I think the war on drugs and all of this trying to enforce people's behavior is as misguided as the war on alcohol was during Prohibition. You just simply can't stop it, and it's futile and actually kind of fascist to kind of try. With that said, I don't know a single person who smokes a lot of dope first of all, I don't know a lot of people who smoke a lot of dope, but I don't know any of them who would consider themselves like marijuana aficionados who are particularly successful or particularly happy. And my attitude towards marijuana is the same as it is to compulsive drinking or heroin addiction, cocaine, LSD, whatever you want to call it. It's a great try. I understand the tragedy because I've been there, but it is a great tragedy to be gifted with the most complex structure in the universe, which is the human brain, and then use the intellect that brain is able to generate in order to find as many ways possible to shut that brain off. That's seems to me to be a particularly poignant tragedy.
Well, the article cites a fast-growing construction company in California that says that some 20 of its 150 employees actually tested positive for cannabinoids, however you pronounce that, in their bloodstream, and yet they were hired anyway. So the 20 out of 150 were hired despite flunking the drug test, essentially. And I guess, Bill, we have to admit that President Trump is to blame because basically employers are saying with the growing economy and low unemployment, it's really hard to find workers. And so you're kind of scraping the bottom of the barrel there, and you're going to get some people who've got a little THC in their system. What's wrong with that? Now, how do you feel about walking around in those buildings in California that were built by guys who are marijuana users?
Well, Scotty, here's the difference between marijuana and alcohol. Marijuana remains detectable long after it's impairing your decision-making abilities. Your liver will pretty much cycle out a pretty good drunk after about 8 hours, but THC remains in the body for quite a long time. So the question really, the reason we're testing is not to see whether a person had consumed marijuana at some point in the past. You could make an argument that says that with a sufficiently sensitive test, you could probably determine if the person smoked marijuana in the last 20 years. That's not the point. The question is not whether or not they did it, certainly in a state where it's become legal, like in California. The question is, are they impaired by it? And to say that a person who tested positive for PHC is automatically disqualified is it not PHC? Is it,
THC.
THC, yes, of course. Yeah. A person who tested positive for that, to say that that person is automatically impaired is to say the same as somebody who got drunk 4 days ago, and we're not going to hire them now because they had a drink, on Monday and it's Friday morning. The question comes down to, are you impaired? And you would like to think, and I rather suspect actually, that natural selection is working on construction sites in a way that it's working in very few other places in the United States. So, look, the people who are most likely to be injured, taking your construction thing as an example, the people who are most likely to be injured are not the people who are likely to inhabit the building. The people who are most likely to be injured by an incapacitated stoner construction worker are the other construction workers. And so you would assume that that any degree of impairment that would alarm them would be enough to get them to take some action, you would assume.
Well, this may startle you, but in 2010, there's a company called Quest Diagnostics that runs these tests for employers. And they found in 2010 that some 1.6% of their urinalysis tests showed signs of THC. By last year, 2018, that figure was 2.5%. Now, on the one hand, you could look at it and go, wow, that's starting to push toward a doubling. On the other hand, you could look at it and say, only 2.5% of people in California have THC in their systems.
Yeah, that's certainly what I would come away with. If you told me it was 20%, I would have thought that was low. And so the question then becomes, at what point does this become a priority? It's always worth talking about. It's always worth discussing. Any kind of look, there is, as far as I can see, there appears to be no difference between somebody coming home after a hard day's work and lighting up a joint and somebody coming home after a hard day's work and having a drink. So for me to be able to say that one is good and the other one's not, which I personally happen to feel, but that's probably just a social artifact on my part. I'm willing to admit that. The question becomes impairment, number one, and number two, long-term damage from habitual use. As I've said, I've known some very nice potheads, especially in college, but I never knew any of them that I particularly wanted working on my house, let alone my brain. And at the same time, we all know people who are just plain lifelong alcoholics who you'd have to put in exactly that same situation. The problem is not so much the availability of marijuana or even of alcohol. The problem is that some percentage of people are not able to stop at the simple relaxation of having a drink on the town or two. There's something about them, and it's usually just indicative of an addictive personality, whether it's alcohol or gambling or whatever the case may be, that forces them to take this to destructive levels. And those pathologies are not limited to marijuana users, and so I don't see any reason why they should be singled out when, in fact, illicit drug use, including alcohol, has destroyed an awful lot of lives. And the solution to that is, I think, having some sense of purpose, some sense of family, some sense of religion, or at the very least, some sense of community.
Isn't this a great exercise of what was once quaintly called federalism, in the sense that in federal law, it's still illegal? The use and possession and distribution of marijuana is still illegal, even though many states have kind of stood up on their hind legs and said, we're going to approve it for certain purposes. Is this a salutary thing, you think, in a federalist republic?
I do. One of the great things about the idea of a federalist republic, where every state gets to make its own decisions about a number of laws, but laws affecting the general security of all the states together, such as sanctuary cities, do not apply in this category. But nevertheless, let's take a look at the last, 50, 60 years or so. Nevada has been an island of either moral corruption or absolute freedom, depending on how you want to look at it. If you take the gambling aside and just put the entire casino thing out of the picture, I remember being young in Florida, which driving in Florida is like driving down an ironing board where you go 8 miles flat straight to the horizon, it cranks 10 degrees to the left, you go another 8 miles to the horizon, and it cranks 10 degrees to the right. I remember that at the time in parts of Nevada, there were no speed limits. You go as fast as you wanted to. That in a number of counties in Nevada, prostitution was legal and still is, although not in Las Vegas. Gambling is legal in Las Vegas. And if you didn't like any of that stuff, you didn't have to live in Nevada. Because I got to tell you, while there's an awful lot of great things to be said about Nevada, and Tahoe and Reno kind of nice, Nevada's not a particularly gorgeous state to live in. So if you don't like the gambling, get out of Nevada. And that's the way it should be. And for people to take cultural predilections and make them federal law is the source of a great deal of all of our problems. If I thought that being surrounded by marijuana outlets was detrimental to my emotional well-being, then I have the perfect right to get the hell out of California. And I have a lot of reasons to get out of California. That's not one of the primary ones.
Well, I was just noting in this article that I read in the Los Angeles Times that the marijuana can remain in the user's system for up to 45 days following use in regular users. It occurs to me that there may be some drinking among airline pilots. The guy smokes a joint 3 weeks ago. Okay for him to fly your plane now? The FAA is very clear on this. It's one of the many things you have to learn in order to get your pilot's license and to move up in instrument rating and commercial pilot and all the rest. 8 hours from bottle to throttle. That's the ironclad rule. You must have 8 hours minimum between the last time you took a drink and the time you fire up the engine on that aircraft. And I would say that there are probably some cases where that may not be quite enough, but I would be willing to bet you that in virtually all cases, 8 hours after you've stopped drinking is enough time to get you pretty sufficiently sobered up. I don't know what the hangover is going to do for you. I've never had one. I'm blessed in that regard, I guess. But nevertheless, I would much rather have a guy who smoked marijuana 3 weeks ago fly my airplane than a guy who had a bunch of scotches on the rocks 3 hours ago. Well, it's for those of us of a certain age, it's hard to imagine if you look back that there would come a day when we were more concerned about the drugs that your doctor prescribed to you than we are about the ones you bought from the hippie on the street corner. But it's getting to be that way. And folks, we're keeping track of the changes to the culture right here at Bill Whittle now 5 days a week. We're grateful for the members at BillWhittle.com who've made it possible. If you'd like to join their ranks, just go to BillWhittle.com and click Become a Member. For Bill Whittle, I'm Scott Ott. Thanks for watching.